This is Tokens. I'm Lee C. Camp.
In these times, when social concerns are so important,
That is Pope Francis, speaking to a joint session of Congress in 2015. It was a historic occasion, the first time a pope had ever addressed a joint session of Congress. And in the midst of that address, he held up 4 Americans as worthy in various ways of emulation: Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., Thomas Merton, and then a 4th.
in these times, when social concerns are so important, I cannot fail to mention the servant of God, Dorothy Day, who founded the Catholic worker movement. Her social activism, her passion for justice and for the cause of the oppressed were inspired by the gospel, her faith, and the example of the saints.
Want to make America great? The Pope provided both recipe and exemplar.
A nation can be considered great when it strives for justice and the cause of the oppressed, as Dorothy Day did.
Turns out a lot of the senators there that day had no idea who Dorothy Day was.
Actually, Senator Kane would later say that some of his fellow senators came up and said, well, why is the Pope talking about Doris Day? Totally got it wrong.
And that is documentary filmmaker Martin Doblmeier.
Well, hello, Lauren. Welcome back.
Good to be back, Lee.
And you were saying?
That is documentary filmmaker Martin Doblmeier, whose most recent film is entitled Revolution of the Heart, the Dorothy Day story.
Dorothy Day really was, I think, one of the most inspiring and courageous women of the 20th century, bar none.
Lee's interview with Martin in just a moment.
Delighted today to have Martin Doblmeier, American documentary filmmaker, known for directing films for public television, including films such as Bonhoeffer, The Power of Forgiveness, An American Conscience, Reinhold Niebuhr story, Backs Against the Wall, the Howard Thurman story, and as well, just out this year, the Dorothy Day story. So we're grateful to have Martin Doblmeier with us today. Welcome, Martin.
Oh, it's nice to be here. Thank you, Lee.
Good to have you in Nashville. You get to Nashville very often?
I get here. I don't get here enough.
Yeah.
I've been here before, but it's we just love being here. It's a great town. It's a great town.
And an old music lover. You've been around loving music for a long time.
Yeah, well, you can't not love music when you come to Nashville.
Yeah.
And I actually went by a store yesterday, just on the ride from the airport. I saw this vintage guitar store,
Yes.
so I'm hoping to get to that before
Carter
I leave.
Vintage Guitars, I think it is. Yeah, very good. Yeah. How did you get it? Tell us just briefly a bit about your love of music and how that's kind of worked into loving being here in Nashville.
Well, what kid doesn't love
Yeah.
music? I mean, I grew up when the Beatles were just breaking. I still remember seeing the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. I'm that old.
Oh, wow.
And I just remember how it just changed everything
Yeah.
for all of us. I mean, that was the unifying moment in America when the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan. And I played my guitars, and we had our bands and everything.
Yeah.
But while I was going to school, studying religion in college, I actually got to be the manager of a nightclub in Connecticut, where I was able to bring in people like Muddy Waters and John Lee Hooker, Bo Diddley, Freddie King.
That's great.
And just the blues greats. And so I'm 21, 22 years old, and and I'm studying religion Monday through Thursday, and then on the weekends I'm running this nightclub and hanging out with the blues greats. And it was just a wonderful life experience for me.
Very nice. Well, welcome to Nashville. Glad that you're here. With the Dorothy Day story that's out this year, the third in a series on...
Yeah, we're calling them prophetic voices.
Prophetic voices. Reinhold Niebuhr being the first, then Howard Thurman, now Dorothy Day. Early in the film, you have Pope Francis' address in 2015, joint session of Congress here in the United States, where he enumerates 4 great Americans that he wants to mention. And he talks about Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., Thomas Merton, and Dorothy Day. And Senator Kane, in your documentary, reports that his colleagues in the Senate are saying, who's Dorothy Day? For those who may not know who are listening, tell us kind of overview of Dorothy Day's story and what got you so interested in telling her story.
Actually, Senator Kane would later say that some of them actually came up to her, some of his fellow senators came up and said, well, why is the Pope talking about Doris Day? Totally got it wrong. Dorothy Day really was, I think, one of the most inspiring and courageous women of the 20th century, bar none. She makes a conversion from being really a sort of a communist sympathizer in her youth to becoming a radical Catholic, and that propels her to become politically, socially active. And she founds a newspaper called the Catholic Worker newspaper, which starts publishing in May of 1933 and has continued to publish without interruption ever since. And parallel to that, shortly after that starting of the newspaper, she was writing about the situation for poor people in America. This is now in the heart of the Depression. And people ask, well, you're writing about the poor. What are you doing about the poor? And that propelled her to go out and get a house and start taking care of the most immediate needs of people who were poor in her midst. And she started what has been called the Catholic Worker Houses of Hospitality. And they have continued now since 1933. So it's a remarkable legacy. When she dies, Dorothy Day, in 1980, at the age of 83, there are 30 Catholic worker houses in America. And that number has just amplified since that time. There's now almost 250 homes for the poor and destitute all across America and even beyond America. And that's all tribute to the thing that she began now back in 1933 and has been needed and necessary ever since.
Yeah. I always found her story just so moving and compelling. What are some of the particular stories about her that you kind of carry with you? Or do you have some that you kind of carry with you that you think of regularly?
Well, I think what's really interesting, you probably were hearing about Dorothy Day because she received an honorary doctorate degree from Notre Dame, and she was very much revered when especially in the later part of her life, when she was being celebrated by major Catholic institutions all across the country, which was really quite different. I mean, the institutional recognition of Dorothy Day's work was always at question. Because in the midst of always doing this basic care for the poor, which everybody admired, she was at the same time questioning how these people were poor, why they were poor, what are the institutional reasons for these people to be in such desperate, dire straits.
I think I remember I've quoted, I think this came from her, I've quoted numerous times where she will say something like, when I feed the poor, people applaud me, but when I ask why people are poor, they tell me to keep quiet and stay to my business. But it was that not just the works of mercy, but works of justice that were central to her.
Yeah, she would say sometimes when I actually feed the poor, everybody loves that, but when I question why they're poor, they call me a communist. And in fact, she didn't really mind that so much because in her youth, she actually saw communism, socialism, as a more fair way to distribute wealth in America. And this is during the 19-teens. And there's major questions that are arising now about how capitalism has gone awry, how it's made incredible fortunes for a handful of people, and that left so many of the average worker where her heart was, destitute and poor. Does it ring any bells about what's happening in America today? So that's why I think people look at Dorothy Day as this really interesting, although complex figure who resonates with the issues that we're still facing in the 21st century.
I think another thing that always made her such a compelling figure to me is this sort of bohemian sort of lifestyle that she lived. She fell in love numerous times, ends up having an abortion, being pregnant. Second time, I guess her second pregnancy with this man that she loved clearly so deeply led to her conversion.
Yeah, she did have the abortion. It was very traumatic. I mean, she was abandoned by the man who she had the child with, and that was just heart-wrenching. Then she goes out and she gets married again, kind of on the rebound, and that doesn't work out so well. She leaves him. So she's spinning for a while in her mid-20s and then finds a person whose name is Foster Bartram, and he just steals her heart. She becomes pregnant. They're not married, and she comes to find out that he won't marry her. And now she's faced with a decision because having been traumatized by the earlier abortion, which was done apparently in a very crude way, and she was fearful that she would never have children. So now she's grateful for the notion that she believes God has given her a child, and she doesn't want to lose this child. So she has the child, and Foster will not marry her. She's been living this bohemian lifestyle for so long, she decides that marriage is the direction she wants to go in. He doesn't want to do that. And so that begins the breakage. And she's, for 5 years, Lee, for 5 years, she's writing him letters and trying to reach out to him saying, won't you do this? We have a child. Can't we just sort of build a normal life together? And he won't do it. And so she finally gives up on that notion. And in a moment of desperation, she's literally throwing herself on God, saying, I have, in the meantime, now become Catholic. She was raised originally in a home that was at best agnostic, at most atheist. And so there was no religion upbringing, but she always felt this haunting, that God was hauntingly calling her. Couldn't quite figure that out, but she's reading scriptures and stories and this, sort of filling herself up. She's made the decision with the birth of her daughter that she wants to become baptized in the Catholic faith and wants the daughter to be baptized. Her husband, by common law, won't marry her, but she's going to go down that path. And that's the beginning of a change in her life that will never end. And it goes on now for the next 50 years of her life. She decides to follow a path to become Catholic, and that just continues to grow and grow and grow.
And it's remarkable that she kind of holds together two things a lot of people seem to presume you can't hold together, namely it's relatively quite conservative Catholic convictions alongside this sort of radical social agenda. How do you see those holding together in her when so often those seem to be separated?
Well, I prefer to use the word that she was a traditional Catholic rather than, because I think the word conservative comes with so much baggage in our times. I say traditional Catholic, and she was. She went to Mass every day. She prayed the Rosary every day. She studied and revered the lives of the saints. So she's a very traditional Catholic, almost like a pre-Vatican II, for those who know. For those who know what the Catholic tradition, the pre-Vatican II kind of Catholic. And yet it's that very foundation that she felt in the Beatitudes and the teachings of Jesus Christ that propels her to act in a way that we would now call politically and socially radical. She was absolutely committed to it. She would not think that deciding that we should be pacifists, full, uncompromising pacifists, is being radical herself. She would not think that. She would say this is simply what she felt as though God was calling her to do. So it's that combination of rather traditional faith that propels her to be what we would now think of as much more forward-thinking in terms of political and social issues.
Another line I remember reading, she would say, don't call me a saint, I don't want to be dismissed that easily. What's behind that when she would say something like that?
Well, during the latter part of her life, she lives to be 83, and it's clear that she's into her 60s, and there are all kinds of stories that are coming out about her. She's she's in New York, first of all, so she's in the media center of the world. So there's all kinds of media that's coming out around her, and she's already being declared a saint. I mean, she's still alive and active, and people are treating her like a saint. And there's plenty of stories about how people would sort of see her coming, and they would know, there's Saint Dorothy. They would think of her as Saint Dorothy. She realized, in some ways, she felt as though that actually could be counterproductive. And so she's famously supposed to have said, nobody's really, I haven't seen this written, but Robert Ellsberg, who was one of her biographers and a great biographer, said that one of her famous lines was, "Don't call me a saint. I don't want to be dismissed that easily." In some ways, it's kind of Dorothy Day because it's counter to everything that she believed. She revered the saints, felt as though they needed to be celebrated more, and followed the saints, the lives of them, and internalized a lot of what they had done in terms of how she wanted to construct the actions of her own life.
One of my favorite pictures on the cover of your film. That's one of my favorite pictures in, I guess, American religious history. Dorothy Day as an I guess elderly woman, maybe in her 70s at this time, sitting in a chair, seeing her seated. And in the foreground of the picture on the right and the left, you can see just the sides of two, I guess, were FBI agents with guns holstered at their sides, standing over her. And I make up that in the picture it's this sort of attempt to intimidate her because she had been on the FBI watch list for years and years. And here she is sitting there, very nonplussed, not threatened at all by these guys standing over her with their guns. But it seems to me that speaks so deeply about who she was as a woman. Arrested, 8 times or so, and put in jail. And this ability, and this very confident woman, confident in the work that she was called to do, and confident in her faith, that she's just not concerned with this threat of violence or imprisonment.
You know, it's we like the photograph too, which is why we've sort of used it as one of the iconic photographs for the story of Dorothy Day, because it does show her in her older years, and yet the body posture you see is somewhat defiant as she's being intimidated by police who've got their hands on their guns. It's really quite a photograph. But that happened in the 1970s when she was in California. So she made the trip all the way from New York in her 70s, all the way out to California, to be part of the demonstrations for Cesar Chavez in support of the Farm Workers Union, something that she really believed in. She would be arrested out there. And the famous background to the story is that she was actually telling the policeman at that time, if you come back tomorrow at the same time, I'll be here tomorrow. If you don't arrest me, I'll be here tomorrow, and I'll recite for you the Beatitudes, which is the reason why we're here. And maybe you would like to hear that, officers.
No, I didn't know that part of the story. That's pretty great. So what did they go on and arrest her then?
Yeah, she was arrested while she was out there. And it was for the 8th and last time that she was arrested. And she's in her 70s. She gets out shortly afterwards. She goes, but she made her statement. She was out there to support the Farm Workers Union. And of course, the farm workers, history then shows that they actually were able to turn the understanding of America from support of the farm owners to the farm workers. Farm workers were in terrible shape at that particular time and really needed to have the national media get behind them. So she felt as though she could bring some attention to what they were doing, and hopefully some change would happen for the situation of the farm workers. But that is so Dorothy Day. She was actually always, throughout the course of her 50-year career, always out there campaigning for the people who really needed to be spoken for. She was clearly, I think, one of the great champions of the poor. And at the time, in the 60s and 70s, the farm workers, especially in California, but also in other parts of the country, Florida and in Arizona, they were living very desperate lives, and they needed champions. Chavez becomes one of them, and Dorothy Day, as best as she could, became one of them too. And of course, she and Chavez become good mates. Chavez comes to her funeral when he comes all the way from California to New York for the funeral of Dorothy Day when she passes away.
Another anecdote I remember reading years ago was that she would say something like, if you think that love is utopian, then just come be with us, and as we clean up the vomit, as we tend to the poor, as we see the very harsh realities that the poor have to deal with. And I think that this sort of hard-nosed realism grounded in the concrete, specific forms of love that she's trying to practice is so compelling. And it's this sort of realism, I guess in some ways it also kind of leads to her being arrested so many times with she's looking at the air raid drills in New York City and realizing this is just propaganda. There's nothing of substance to what's going on here. But tell us a little bit about that story and how she kind of is able to do this very realistic social critique while also holding on to very high standards for her own practice of love.
Well, I'm old enough actually to remember that we would have air raid drills. That's how old I am. I remember that the nuns in Catholic school would force us all to get down and get underneath our desk, and we were all taught to put our hands over our heads, as if that would do anything to protect us if a nuclear bomb was dropped on the city.
I remember doing those as a child in school in Alabama, public schools in Alabama. Yeah.
And you're a good, dutiful student, and you just do it, and it puts the fear of God in you. I mean, all of us were traumatized by that, just the notion of it.
Yeah.
But she felt as though what we were doing with these kinds of drills were in some way showing that you could protect yourself against a nuclear bomb being dropped, which was total lunacy.
Yeah.
And she felt that all you were doing, and the phrase that comes up, is anesthetizing us to the horrors of the notion of using nuclear weapons. So she is one of the first people, and her Catholic worker organizations, they're out on the street saying, no, we're not going to participate in these civil defense drills. And she gets arrested. She gets arrested every year from 1955 until 1961 for protesting, not participating in the civil defense drill. She's out on the streets with banners and everything else. Her numbers are growing all the time, meaning that the second, third, and fourth year they're doing it, they have many more people who are joining the demonstration. She gets arrested every time, and finally in 1961, they just ended the drills. So in some ways, I think the Catholic workers felt as though that was a big triumph for them.
Yeah.
But in many ways, that's part of the of the way Dorothy Day operated. If she just felt as though this was wrong, the principle of it was all wrong, she would be out on the streets risking herself to be able to make a statement to say, this has to stop.
And similarly, I did not remember this, but I learned it from your film, that apparently the Catholic worker begins the Vietnam protests. Is that do I understand that correctly?
Yeah, I think they're some of the first draft card burners that are actually from the Catholic worker. And actually, one of the Catholic workers tortures himself. I think it was at the United Nations, and that just sent a shock wave through the Catholic worker movement. That was they didn't want that. That was not their intention to do that. Someone in their minds took it a little too far. But they wanted to be very clear about their vocal resistance to the war in Vietnam. It was even more clear to them that had to be resisted than it was for the Second World War. They were out early. The Catholic worker was initially resisted the notion of going to war to stop Hitler and the Japanese, and that drew them an incredible amount of resistance within their own movement. People who said, no, this is a just war. We need to be out there doing something about that. And I have felt, Lee, some of this because as I've been on the road now with the film, showing the film, getting responses from literally thousands of people that are coming out to see the film, I've already gotten pushback from people, especially people who are parents of those serving in the military right now. And I have people come up to me and say, this is very off-putting for us because our son or daughter is serving in the military. They're currently in Iraq or Afghanistan or somewhere else in the world, serving what they think is playing an important role in defending American values. And watching your film on Dorothy Day is very disturbing because we see ourselves as good Catholics or good Christians and good faithful people, and we don't get how it's possible that we should feel as though we aren't serving the proper way. We're not doing the right thing. And I think this kind of story leaves a lot of people to go home and really evaluate how they think about this. The Catholic Church has had this long tradition of what they call the just war theory. It goes all the way back to St. Augustine. And at the same time, now there's an opening within Catholic tradition to say, the pacifist position should have an opening too within our faith tradition to speak for it. And I think Dorothy Day is in part responsible for that.
Yeah, I guess it was the early 1980s that the United States Catholic bishops began to say that pacifism was a legitimate witness to the gospel alongside the just war tradition. Do you think she played a part in that beginning to be a possibility in American Catholic practice?
Yeah, I was around and followed that. I was actually a journalist doing a lot of journalism during the 1980s when that was happening. Personally, I was very proud of the Catholic Church for coming together as an organization and making those kind of statements. I know how difficult it was, how much resistance they got to those statements, how well researched they were before they made their proclamations. But this is the mid-1980s. Dorothy Day has only passed away a few years prior to that. So there's no question that Dorothy Day, in the notion of a Catholic committed to pacifism, total, uncompromising pacifism, had an influence on that.
You are listening to Tokens, Public Theology, Human Flourishing, and the Good Life. We're most grateful to have you joining us. Please go over and leave us one of those 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts and subscribe there or wherever you subscribe to podcasts.
And remember, you can find our links, photos, books, and related videos from our extensive YouTube channel, all at tokenshow.com/podcast.
I loved the conversation there with Martin Doblmeier and him pointing, as I've always loved in Dorothy Day, to her holding together both works of mercy and justice and kind of holding together in both of those, especially being attentive to the poor.
Yeah, that's right. In listening to her story, it really reminds me of this sort of uncomfortable truth for many of us that in Scripture, there is mention after mention of the person of God needing to defend the rights of the poor and the needy. Jesus talks so little about sex, for example, but so much about the poor. And yet we do a much better job focusing on getting sex right. And we say very little in the church relatively about getting it right when we defend the rights of the poor. And she reminds us of that being this obvious obvious element of what it means to be people of God.
Yeah. And this sort of notion too of holding together things that most people don't presume you can hold together. Her holding together being a traditional Catholic and being a social radical, I think is just fascinating.
It reminds me of a quote that I heard from Pope Francis that I've often returned to, which is when asked if he was a liberal or a conservative, he said, I'm neither. I am a Catholic.
Yeah, it seems to me as a someone who's not a Catholic, but I've learned a lot from being in Catholic contexts. It's amazing to me about how the Catholics do seem to be better about trying to hold together. You certainly have so-called traditional Catholics who are socio-political conservatives and liberal Catholics who are socio-political liberals, but it's fascinating that they seem to be more prone to be able to hold being a traditional Catholic and being a social radical together better than Protestants are. It seems like we kind of divide one over against the other rather than being able to hold them together somehow.
I wonder why that is.
Yes, maybe it's because the word Catholic means universal. I don't know.
Maybe. I wonder if there's something there with our history of, for Protestants, we were so allergic to the idea that there were any outward signs of righteousness. We made it so interior that I wonder if we diminished our sense of outward signs of righteousness and this kind of discipline of caring for the poor.
Yeah. I wonder, too, if there's a space. I remember, as you were saying that, I remember flashing back to my first semester in grad school at Notre Dame, and at break, we were in the home of one of the professors he was a well-known liberal Catholic, moral philosopher, moral theologian, and so we got started talking about Catholic different camps and groups, and I realized that they had these sorts of very conservative groups who had their own sorts of papers, and they would write up all the liberals, and then they had the liberals who couldn't hardly stand the conservatives. And at one point I said, y'all don't understand how unusual this is for a Protestant, because if we have those sorts of differences, we just break away.
That's
and
right.
We go start our own group.
Mm-hmm.
And they started laughing, and they said, yeah, that's the beauty of a papacy. They said, you Protestants assume that because we have a papacy, we all think the same thing. And they said, actually, the papacy allows us to have a greater amount of diversity and stay together.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, isn't that fascinating? Mm-hmm. Last kind of comment here. I do always admire those who can put themselves in a situation where they will get themselves arrested. I just think that's fascinating. And this woman, Dorothy today, those of you who haven't seen this picture that I described in the interview, you can go see that on the webpage. But it is this provocative, beautiful picture of this elderly, strong woman, just nonplussed, not intimidated by them at all. And the fascinating way in which she was able to see social formation going on in those air raid drills, and that line about she wanted to call to attention the ways in which those air raid drills and these social practices anesthetized us to the horrors of the world.
Well, yeah, I think if you try really hard, you could probably get arrested.
Yeah. I bet I could, yes. I haven't done it yet, though.
There's still time.
Yeah, maybe so. Well, coming up, I talk with Martin about his films on Howard Thurman, Reinhold Niebuhr, and how doing public theology can get you in trouble with the FBI. So maybe there'll be more there for us.
Part 2 in just a moment. You are listening to Tokens and Lee's interview with documentary filmmaker Martin Doblmeier. How did you get started wanting to tell stories like this? Just in the, 30, 40 years now doing documentary filmmaking, what's driven you and kept you going in such work?
Well, it's always, I wish I could say I had the moment like St. Paul where I know the moment where I was knocked off the horse and everything changed. But I'm in high school, and my high school teacher, I went to a Catholic boys' school, and I still remember the day that our religion teacher gave us a copy of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Letters and Papers from Prison. And I was so moved by that book that I carried it with me into the dugout in playing baseball. So I would literally be sitting in the dugout reading letters and papers from prison, waiting for my turn to get to bat.
Wow.
And it just never left me. And so I made a decision early on in college, even though there wasn't yet at the time a program specifically in religion, that we sort of crafted one out of the classes that were available. And then by my sophomore year, there was a program. I was a little bit responsible for that, or they saw me as somebody who could help out with that. And there was a program in religious studies at school. And so I took all of that, took all my courses. And then as my last course in college, I decided it's 1975, and I was going to go to Eastern Europe at the time, was still under the wall of communism, and I was going to study what it was like to be a person of faith in East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. Spent the whole summer of 1975 there, and came back and wrote my paper, and newspapers saw what I was doing kind of on my own. I mean, I was naive about all of this, and I got hired to write for newspapers, and that sort of propelled me down the path. So it's been like this, trying to understand what God's calling me to do and how I should respond to it, and looking for the signals that are going on in the lives of people all around me.
Yeah.
And over time, I guess you sort of develop like a musician does. You just sort of develop your riffs.
Yeah.
You get your place,
Right.
you get your rhythms, you start to feel comfortable that you can just sort of pick up the instrument and do it. And for me, the instrument was the communication through film. I don't think of myself first as a documentary filmmaker who happens to be making films about religion. I think of myself first, clearly, as somebody who's interested in religion, faith, and spirituality, how to live our lives in this world in this way. And my way to communicate that, my way to engage that, is through the filmmaking. I get to sit down with Jesse Jackson and talk to him about social justice and religion because I'm a filmmaker, not because I'm just some guy who walked in off the street. The filmmaking gets me the entree to be able to do that, and now people have seen the films and know the films over the years. But I could walk away from the filmmaking thing tomorrow. I could use another vehicle of expression, whether it was theater or book writing or playwriting or something else. But the religion, faith, and spirituality component, I can't walk away from that. I think there's so much more to be able to do.
Right. So we're in a particularly volatile time, it seems, in American history. I was wondering, as I was watching three of your films this week, and I thought, I wonder when Martin is putting these together, or when he watches them after they're finished, if he has any particular moments where he thinks, "Oh, I really wish someone would pay attention to that story." I mean, do you carry on this sort of inner dialogue about, of how desperately so-and-so, and no need to name names, but how you wish so-and-so might hear this, or so-and-so might hear this, or I don't know. I guess what I'm getting at is that all of these things, even though you're talking about things that happened in some cases 90, 100 years ago, they seem so terribly relevant right now. So how are you processing that in your internal dialogue with yourself?
Well, if like a practical example of what you mean is, do I wish that Donald Trump would invite me to come and give a screening at the White House of Dorothy Day? Yes. I'd love to have that happen. We're in Washington, D.C., and if you called me up and said, come over in an hour, I'd like to see your movie, I'd be there in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
But is that going to happen? I don't know. I mean, ultimately, my job is to make the film, and it's been gratifying to see the response these films are getting. I said that it's actually gotten to be #1 on Amazon for documentary films.
Marvelous.
This new film on Dorothy Day, and we're thrilled about that. When you think about it, thanks. It's a countercultural film.
Yeah.
I mean, I get that. I mean, we're in Nashville right now, and for a while, the #1 film I think had been Ken Burns's Country Music.
Right. Yeah.
So how do you knock that off?
Yeah.
how do you knock that off? And why do you want to knock that off?
It's amazing. Yeah.
So, but we were like #1 for new documentary films, and we were thrilled about that. And so my job is to open up my heart, to listen, to make the best possible film I can make. And then literally hope to God that somebody can pay attention to it and go forward, and just see what happens. That's the way I think about it.
Yeah. Prior to the Dorothy Day story, you tell the Howard Thurman story, which that came out last year, 2019.
It did. It was released in February for Black History Month on public television, 2019.
Yeah. How did you get started telling Thurman's story? Or maybe before that, tell us a little bit about the outline of Thurman's story. Well,
Thurman is really one of the unsung American heroes. Yeah. He's an African-American theologian, and he really, he is one of the more important influences and mentors to both Martin Luther King Jr. and to many of the leaders, the iconic leaders of the civil rights movement. He was part of the reason why the civil rights movement was not just a social and political movement, but it was also a spiritual movement. And Howard Thurman is at the heart of that. He's the one who gives them a sense of foundation. One of the great living civil rights icons, Otis Moss Jr., I had the privilege to interview him for that film. His line was that Howard Thurman was the one who gave us the reason for the march, how we march, and what we do after the march.
Wow.
And so all that is clearly attributed. And you know, Lee, when you interview somebody like Jesse Jackson or Congressman John Lewis, who was so pivotal in the civil rights movement, or Otis Moss, Vernon Jordan, and you ask them, would you talk a little bit about this extraordinary character, Howard Thurman? And their eyes just light up. And you can see that even now they carry with them a memory from 40 and 50 years ago that still invigorates them and inspires them today when they want to talk about Howard Thurman. Thurman is first of all, he's the grandson of slaves. His grandmother was born into slavery in Florida, and she's the one who really teaches him, as he would say, more about God and faith than any of the theological education he ever received. He always attributed his grandmother's understanding about that because she firmly believed that no matter what the wider culture is going to tell you or teach you as a young African American boy growing up in America, that you are first and foremostly a child of God, and that God has a place for you, and that God loves you, and God is going to give you the opportunity that you need. And that gave him the foundation. And so, as Jesse Jackson would say, later on, as a fully mature man, Howard Thurman would teach us that in the civil rights movement, they may beat us, they may break our arms, they may break our legs, but in fact, they cannot take our soul from us. And that's all Howard Thurman.
I'm drawing a blank on the story that you tell that Thurman would tell about his grandmother. There's some episode maybe that.
Yes, Thurman's grandmother, whose name was Nancy Ambrose, she would always reveal, as she was growing up, and an enslaved person at that time, that there were actually itinerant African-American preachers who were themselves slaves, who were being allowed to come to different plantations and to preach once a month and once every couple of months. And Howard Thurman's grandmother clearly remembered and recounted the stories of whenever he would come to preach, no matter what the topic of the sermon, he would always end it by saying, "You are not slaves. You are not," and he used that word, "but you are children of God, and never forget that." And that's the story that Howard Thurman grew up hearing and became convinced that deep down inside, no matter what this culture is telling us to do, no matter how much the culture tries to push us down, belittle us, diminish us in every way it possibly can, that you are a child of God and that God has a place for you and God holds you dear. And that's what gave them the energy to go forward.
That's a powerful story. And out of that kind of slave experience, he would go on to write a book about the slave spirituals, if I remember correctly.
Yes, Deep River was one of the first times that anybody ever put language to the storylines behind many of the different spirituals. So it's a wonderful little book, and it really was one of the first attempts to sort of get some background to some of the spirituals. And the interesting thing that we try to draw out in the film is that the songs, the hymns, the spirituals that became so central to the civil rights movement were all drawn on the spirituals that were happening back, especially during slave times. And so the civil rights movement knew that it was connecting to its own ancestral heritage in two ways. Number one, to those spirituals, but also, two, that it was part of this ongoing, unfolding story of Moses saving his people, bringing his people out of slavery. And so that's one of the reasons, too, why especially Martin Luther King was inviting people like Abraham Joshua Heschel and people like that into the marches, because King was smart enough to know that if we can connect this to our own, as African Americans, our own ancestral roots in slavery through the songs that we were singing and the traditions, but also to connect them to Jews and the story of the Bible of Moses delivering people out of captivity in Egypt, that the size of our movement just continues to grow, and the character of our movement will actually be even wider than our own.
Well, and that ends up being a key factor in Thurman's, I guess, I don't know if conversion is the right word, to nonviolence, is his own experience in India, if I remember that correctly. He travels there and begins to see the plight of the Indian population under the British colonialism. Gandhi is calling people, his brothers and sisters, to nonviolence, and then he carries that back, right, to the United States?
He does, yeah. No, Howard Thurman is the first African-American who's invited to come to India and to meet, have private sessions and conference with I think, maybe the most influential figure in the world at the time. That's Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi. And this is in the mid-1930s. And there's two things going on. So Gandhi wants to learn from Thurman what it's like to be raised as a Christian, as an African-American Christian in a country where you're still now, even in 1936, so generations after slavery has formally ended, but you're still living in a highly segregated country. And everything that the white majority can do to push you down still continues. How do you live like that? And that there was a sense of, how can you even come here to India and preach about Christianity when you see the results of Christianity in your own country? So Gandhi's sort of navigating through all that. But Thurman, on the other side, wants to learn, how is it possible that you can actually have this kind of social political environment of your people in India, and yet resist it and hope to make a change in a nonviolent way. And the first thing that Thurman learns is that Gandhi is spiritually grounded. I think that's the biggest, and Thurman writes about this a lot. He says that what he could not deny was that this was a spiritual, holy man that he encountered in Gandhi, who was rooted in tradition, who understood that God was in his heart, and that this is the anchor out of which he was operating. And so in some ways, that's parallel to what Thurman had learned from his grandmother, that when God is at the center of your heart, you're able to do incredible things, but because that foundation is strong for you. And so Gandhi taught this to Thurman. Thurman then turns around and comes back to the United States. This is the 1940s and during the Second World War and into the 50s. And he's traveling around America, and he's preaching the notion of nonviolence as a way to resist all the oppressions that are happening to African American people. And Martin Luther King is in the pews, and he's listening to Thurman preach, taking all these notes, and he then becomes the real mouthpiece for all that's going to be happening in the civil rights movement as a nonviolent resistance.
Yeah. It's remarkable, as an American Christian to hear, as an American white Christian, to hear Gandhi ask this African American man, how can you hold on to Christianity when you see the fruit of what Christianity has done or failed to do? I guess I would want to say failed to do, but.
And I think one of the big, and it's not just Gandhi who's asking this. Thurman would, during the course of many months in India, give over 100 lectures. And there was an unforgettable encounter, not only with Gandhi, but with a lawyer who said exactly the same thing. How is it possible that you can come over here to India and talk about Christianity when we know what's going on in America and how you as African Americans are being treated by whites? And these are Christian whites. You're Christian. How can you possibly do that? And he said, and Thurman's response, I think, is prophetic in many ways. He says, I'm not here to talk about the religion of Christianity, which has done this to my people, and has done this to my people over the course of history in our country. I'm here to talk about the religion of Jesus. I make a distinction between the religion of Christianity and the religion of Jesus. What Jesus did was to preach a gospel that talked about care for those who are in need, standing by those who are oppressed, liberating the people who need to be freed and who justifiably need to be able to walk in freedom. That's the religion I believe in.
And it's remarkable just from a theological perspective, and I don't want to get too geeky here, but his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, by some will get critiqued for its Christology, by not enough focus upon the Christ of faith, and because he's focusing so much on the humanity of Christ or humanity of Jesus. And yet, his focus upon the humanity of Jesus gives Jesus much more normative power of saying that this is really who we're supposed to be than the so-called Christology of focusing on the Christ of faith. There's a remarkable sort of twist there.
Yeah, it is, and I think it's understandable given Thurman's own personal background and what he came from. There's a line in the film that says that it's interesting how whites talk about the Christ and blacks talk about Jesus. There's a difference in an understanding about how those two things really aren't necessarily the same.
Yeah.
The Christ and the life of Jesus.
Yeah.
So, and I think his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, Thurman's book, Jesus and the Disinherited, when I read it as a white male, I found it to be absolutely compelling. And every time I've sat down in gatherings with African Americans who were sort of looking for the model of how to understand Jesus Christ, they found it just eye-opening and life-changing.
Yeah. So here you are telling stories about people like Dorothy Day, Howard Thurman, and in both of those stories, you can see so clearly a sort of manifestation of what's called Christianity in the American context, that from the perspective both of Dorothy Day and Howard Thurman is deeply antithetical to what they perhaps would call true Christianity or the religion of Jesus, to use Thurman's phrase. And so I suppose one question I'm interested in seeing as you've studied their stories so closely and have told their story so well, what kind of account can you give, or do you give, or do you try to give an account for this, of the ways in which Christianity can appear to grow so corrupt or fail so deeply to be what it seems to have been intended to be?
No, that's a great question. So if I'll cheat a little bit and go back even further and say the first film that I've done in this series is a film on the great American public theologian Reinhold Niebuhr.
Mm-hmm.
And Reinhold Niebuhr's great gift was his honesty and frankness about the interconnectedness between the Christian faith and the human story, the human behavior, the patterns we see so evident in human behavior. And one of the things that, one of the simple facts that Thurman does not ignore is that human behavior tells us again and again and again that people do not give up power. It has to be taken from them. Nobody wants to share the power that they have, the authority that they have. Even though it may have been wrongfully gained, they do not want to share that. And so that's one of the guiding lights for Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, to talk about, how we're not going to be just given as a gift a full share in this American story. We're going to have to campaign. We're going to have to get out on the streets. So that's why Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement all saw Niebuhr as one of the guiding visionaries for it, because that is the repetitive story in human behavior. That nobody wants to give up the power. And certainly over the first centuries in this country, white Christianity was the dominant force. And it painfully did everything it could to make sure that it stayed that way.
Yeah, so Niebuhr has this sort of brilliant critique of power and the ways in which power becomes especially corrupt in social groupings. Moral Man in Moral Society, one of his most famous books. I remember having read that Niebuhr said near the end of his life that if he had that book to title over again, he would have made it Immoral Man, More Immoral Society. Yeah. But this sort of brilliant critiques of power and the way they're at work in social groupings. So how would you see that basic observation being crucial to this project then that you're doing of American prophetic voices?
Well, then that's a great question. So yes, I think that Niebuhr wizened up during the course of his life. He writes this book, Moral Man and Immoral Society, in 1932. He's about, in his late 20s, early 30s when he writes the book. It's a brilliant observation. It's considered one of the great books on social behavior. Still remains that. And yet at the same time, he realizes that it was even worse. As he got older, he realized that the situations were even worse than he had imagined. And so for me, the theme, Moral Man and Immoral Society, based around the idea that as an individual, we're all capable of doing really noble things. Actually, we're capable of doing things that serve not ourselves first, but actually serve others. But once we get into groups, whatever kind of group that is, whether it's associations or even nation states, we have a self-interest that is undeniable. And that's what he was pointing out to and resisting all the way through. And that, I think, holds true through some of the stories that follow with Thurman and with Dorothy Day. Thurman understands that. Thurman is he understands Niebuhr. Thurman and Niebuhr are friends. They associated over the course of the 1930s. They connected. They didn't always agree on everything.
Yeah.
Well, but they certainly respected each other. And so that's part of Thurman's world, his sphere of influence. And the same thing holds true with Dorothy Day. She did not interact with Reinhold Niebuhr, and she did not interact with Howard Thurman. And yet at the same time, she understood that here I am, taking care of individuals who come knocking on my door, who need meals and who need to be housed and taken care of. As a one-on-one, we can take care of these people. And yet at the same time, it's incumbent on her, she would believe, to go out and speak truth to power and see if we can get these structures that are creating the situation changed.
I think, too, another story that just came to my mind reading from Dorothy Day was that in her critiques of the system, she says, we're all part of the filthy, rotten system. And that's one thing, again, that makes her so compelling to me is that she has, the power of sin running through her, too, but she's trying to take very, very seriously. But that doesn't excuse us from taking seriously what we can do to bear witness to a different sort of way in the world. So it does seem to me that's a fascinating kind of, though she would be very different than Niebuhr, a fascinating sort of overlap. They're both able to see the reality of what they might call sin and its power in both individuals and systems and their struggle with that.
Yeah, they both did talk about sin. I mean, Niebuhr talks about sin quite a lot during the course of his work, and so does Dorothy Day. Dorothy Day, she would also be critical of people who would come to her and talk about how they're living their lives on the interest of their wealth, and it would just be shocking to her. And she would just the notion in her mind of having an excessive amount of money that would allow you to live off the interest rates just sent her reeling, and she would let people know that was sinful as far as she was concerned. That while you're having such an accumulation, that other people are suffering, and so she was radical in that sense. I mean, she was certainly not. And I think, from my own point of view, I mean, I make these films because I started out 35 years ago trying to decide how I want to live my life in terms of faith. And you make a film like Dorothy Day and you live with this content for a couple of years. You read the books and you hear the stories and you interview everybody else. How can you not go home at the end of the day and think, oh gosh, I believe in the same God that she believes in. I read the same kind of text that she believes, that she's reading. How can I not say to myself, does she set the bar? Is this what God's asking me to do? Am I failing? Have I just filled my life with Christian compromise and figured out a way to negotiate everything so I can live like this? I think she struggled every day with trying to understand how she was supposed to live her life. I didn't always agree with it, but I think the challenge for all of us as people of faith is we have to listen to these kind of models like a Dorothy Day or a Reinhold Niebuhr and say, look, these are people that are pointing a way. How do I see this path? Yeah. And how do I live this path myself? And where am I making the compromises that I shouldn't be making?
Yeah. One of the things that's fascinating to me, here you have these three characters, and certainly as we both have noted, Dorothy Day would have sharp areas of difference with Reinhold Niebuhr, as would Howard Thurman. But one of the things that's similar about all three of them is that they both, in various ways, are seen as, we might put this in scare quotes, un-American, or in some cases they're literally on an FBI watch list. Why have you found it compelling or important for you to tell stories about those who have been dubbed un-American?
Well, I didn't. That's a great question. I didn't go out looking for stories about people who were dubbed un-American. Yeah. That wasn't my starting place. My starting place literally was to say, I'd like to do something that I think is a service to people in the 21st century who are trying to figure out how to live their life of faith in a complex and growingly more complex society and political environment. And so I said, how about if we take a look at some of these characters, and we're going to do four now. That's Niebuhr and Howard Thurman, Dorothy Day, and the last one in this series will be Rabbi Abraham Heschel, who himself also was on the FBI watch list. I think, to be honest, back in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, J. Edgar Hoover, who's heading up the FBI, is just off the wall in terms of anything that he thought could be considered subversive behavior, threatening to the American way of life, pro-communism, anti-American. You got on the list. There was a 500-page file on on Reinhold Niebuhr. 500 pages.
Wow.
And this is a theology professor at Union Theological Seminary. He's not out there organizing and raising money on behalf of communist behavior. He's simply identifying the rights and the wrongs of the American political behaviors. Dorothy Day's she's on the list, and she's been identified as someone who needs to be watched in the case of a national emergency, and there were even considerations that she would be brought up for sedition. Why? Because she's railing against American policy, especially during Vietnam War, and she was railing against American military policy during the Second World War. Who's doing that? I mean, everybody sort of got on board in the Second World War. So Hoover is a little overzealous, I think, in identifying the people that would be considered threats. Remember, this is the McCarthy era. Anybody who spoke out against the system was deemed a threat and possible communist. So I didn't start off with looking at that, but I did find it interesting, undeniably interesting, that the people that I admired because of their courage to speak out and actually hold America accountable for not living up to the ideals of its own declaration. And these are people who do this out of a religious context. Those were the people that I admired.
Yeah.
I didn't agree with everything. I don't agree with everything from Dorothy Day's life. I just don't. But at the same time, you got to look at her and say, look, this is a life that's been lived with authority and with a sense of recklessness and out of conscience. And how can you not deal with that?
Yeah. You used the word courage. I realize maybe been teaching 2 decades now, and maybe 10 years ago, it finally occurred to me, I can teach a really great ethics course, but if my students don't have any courage, it really isn't going to matter all that much. And so I've been pushing much harder my students to think about the 4 cardinal virtues along with the 3 theological virtues, and really trying to push them on trying to take seriously, that Aristotle teaches us you become a courageous person by doing courageous deeds. So what, when you look at these lives, what do you see in their life that enabled them to become courageous people, to speak in the ways they did and to live in the ways that they did?
Well, first of all, Lee, I admire what you're doing in terms of teaching ethics. Most of the time, people are being taught how to have wild success in a commercial world that we're living in, and that becomes the ethic. I spent a lot of time on college campuses. I talked to a lot of people, and they really feel the pressure, incredible pressure, to be financially, economically successful. And the whole question of where your values lie in order to get to that goal, which is the expectation that you have, your peers have, your parents have, that they're going to be. Do parents talk anymore about, holding firm to your ethical beliefs, or saying, no, we wanted to see you succeed in life. The career success is what the ultimate goal is. So you talking to them about the fundamental virtues of life and the notion of acting in an ethical behavior, and a way of ethical behavior, really is central, I think, to these storylines that we're looking at. And I applaud you for doing that. I think one of the things that Dorothy Day does is that she is so countercultural, especially to what's going on in America today, by not only is she feeding the poor and taking care of those who are oppressed, but she's actually calling herself and everyone around her who's part of the Catholic worker movement to live in poverty themselves. That's ultimate countercultural in America today. And that's a value that says that we don't have to buy into everything. We can live in the simplest way, care for those who are in need, and care for them on a one-to-one basis, personal responsibility for those who are in need, as an equal, not me with economic and financial success looking down and giving you a handout. I'm going to be in the trenches with you, and we're going to fight this thing out together. And that is as countercultural a statement in America today as you'd ever want to find.
Yeah. It's been a privilege to have you with us. Thank you so much.
No, this has been my joy. Thank you, Lee.
Thank you, Martin. You've been listening to Tokens, Public Theology, Human Flourishing, The Good Life, and our interview with Martin Doblmeier, documentary filmmaker. Our interview occasioned by the release of his brand new documentary on Dorothy Day entitled Revolution of the Heart.
Thank you for joining us. Please remember to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and please remember to refer us to a fellow podcast listener.
And if you have feedback, we'd love to hear from you. Email us, text, or attach a voice memo. Send to the address podcast@tokensshow.com. Our thanks to all the stellar team that make this podcast possible. My co-host, Lauren Smeltzer-White, executive producer and manager, Christy Bragg of Bragg Management, co-producer, Jacob Lewis of Great Feeling Studios, associate producer, Leslie Thompson of Rogue Creative Marketing and Media, associate producer, Ashley Bain, engineer, Carrie Ed Harmon, production assistant, Kara Fox, and our live event production team at Stonebrook Media, led by Phil Barnett. Thank you for listening. Peace be unto thee. This Tokens podcast is a production of Tokens Media LLC and Great Feeling Studios, both in Nashville, Tennessee.